March 9, 1945. Tokyo slept under a clear sky, silence interspersed only with the distant roar of sirens, sounds that, at this point in the war, no longer caused panic. The Japanese command believed that the Americans had exhausted their forces after months of ineffective high-altitude bombing. No general in Tokyo expected that this dawn would mark the end of an entire world. That trust, cultivated among trenches and imperial doctrines, was about to be swallowed up by the largest non-nuclear air attack in history. An attack that did not use atomic bombs, but fire. Fire in an industrial state, calculated, launched with scientific precision by 325 B-29 bombers that flew over the city as if they were cogs in a flying power plant. It was no longer war. It was manufacturing on a continental scale. This video chronicles the exact moment when the Japanese capital became the laboratory of a new form of destruction. It reveals in detail how the logistical and technical power of the United States destroyed 15 square miles of city in a few hours. And it shows how an entire empire, armed with pride and wood, was defeated by barrels of napalm and a well-crafted spreadsheet. That night, the world saw the fire become foreign policy. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any image. In just one night, more than 100,000 people burned to death. It wasn't in Hiroshima. It wasn't in Nagasaki. It was in Tokyo, under conventional bombs, without radiation, without warning. By dawn, 267,171 buildings had disappeared from the map, and the world moved on. This is the deadliest airstrike in modern history, and almost no one outside of Japan talks about it. If you value the preservation of memory, the rigor of history, and the truth behind the victories, leave the like and subscribe. This helps this channel to continue bringing to light what time has tried to erase. While the skies of the Pacific seemed unattainable to most aircraft of the time, a new shadow began to form on the drawing boards of American engineers. It was 30 meters long, 43 meters long, had 4 Wright R-3350 engines with more than 2,200 horsepower each, and a range of almost 6,500 kilometers at full load. But what really made the B-29 Superfortress unique wasn't its size or power. It was the intelligence embedded in each bolt. Pressurized compartments allowed crews to operate at high altitudes without relying on oxygen masks. The defensive turrets were controlled by computerized targeting systems with gyroscopes and automatic trajectory calculation. It was a flying weapon that thought, reacted, and adapted. When the first prototype took off in 1942, Japan still believed that its island defense would be sufficient to prevent deep bombardment. The German command also did not understand what was emerging on the other side of the Atlantic. At a confidential meeting in Berlin, Luftwaffe engineers analyzed the reports of the American bombers and concluded no propeller plane would be able to carry more than 10 tons and maintain speeds above 500 km/h, an estimate that the B-29 would easily exceed. The total cost of the Superfortress development program exceeded $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project, which created the atomic bombs. More than one. 4 million engineering hours were put into its development, mobilizing universities, private companies, and the War Department in a joint operation of unprecedented complexity. The central pressurization system alone took 18 months of continuous research. Meanwhile, Japan still relied on models derived from bombers from the 1930s, such as the Mitsubishi G4M, known among American pilots as the Flying Lighter, given its tendency to explode on first impact. The Germans, meanwhile, had the dreaded Heinkel He-177, which suffered from chronic overheating and structural instability. No Axis power possessed anything remotely comparable to the efficiency, autonomy, and endurance of the B-29. In all, more than 3,900 units would be produced by the end of the war, many of them manufactured in uninterrupted shifts by factories such as Boeing's in Wichita, Kansas, which alone assembled 4 aircraft per working day. At this point, it is worth pausing. American production of B-29s exceeded by almost 10 times the number of strategic bombers that Germany could keep operational per month. If this statistic surprised you, write in the comments, absolute power, because that's exactly what the B-29 stood for. Not just an airplane, but the flying embodiment of America's logistical power. The aircraft was built with system redundancy, armor at vital points, and a payload capacity that allowed it to adapt to conventional, incendiary, and, in the future, nuclear bombs. Its fuselage housed one of the first practical applications of pressurized tunneling between compartments, connecting nose and tail by a kind of flexible tube that allowed internal movement even at high altitudes. It was a concept worthy of science fiction for any other country at that time. The training required months of specific preparation, and each mission was coordinated by highly specialized ground teams. A single B-29 in flight represented in practice the daily work of hundreds of workers, engineers, mechanics, and analysts. Behind each takeoff, there was an invisible army of logistics. The B-29 wasn't just a technical response to the war, it was an industrial message. When he first appeared in the Pacific theater, Japanese forces did not know how to react. The altitude was too high for the fighters to reach effectively. The cruising speed made it difficult for anti-aircraft artillery to aim, and night raids, guided by radio navigation systems, completely eluded traditional methods of interception. Japanese radars, still in their primitive stage, picked up echoes that disappeared in seconds. Japanese military doctrine, founded on discipline and personal heroism, now showed its fragility in the face of a machine made not to depend on human error. General LeMay, upon assuming command of the 21st Bomb Command in January 1945, declared that the B-29 is the last word of American industry, but it had not yet found its maximum application. That would change in March of that year. With tactical modifications and logistical adjustments, what was once a promise would become an instrument of systematic annihilation. And the first target would be the capital of a nation that, until then, believed that the war could be won with courage and bamboo-sharpening bayonets. But before the B-29 pours fire on Tokyo, something even more radical would be needed, completely changing the way it is used, and the decision would come from a general willing to sacrifice doctrine in the name of absolute effectiveness. The victory in the skies began long before takeoff. On the ground, among conveyor belts, rivets, and workers working 3 shifts in a row, the war took shape in steel, welding, and screws. As Japan reorganized its schools to melt down kitchen utensils for reusable aluminum, American industry built a new Air Force every day. In Wichita, Kansas, Boeing oversaw production at a near-surgical pace. 4.2 B-29s rolled off the lines each weekday, a logistical feat as precise as a bombing mission. But Wichita was just one cog in the wheel. Other Boeing plants operated in Seattle and Renton. Glen L. Martin produced in Omaha. Bell Aircraft was delivering results in Marietta, Georgia. The production system was as decentralized as it was coordinated. Wings in one state, airframes in another, engines arriving by rails, specialized technicians overseeing each integration. It was no longer a war of soldiers against soldiers. It was a war of infrastructure against improvisation. While German engineers optimized underground assembly lines after Allied bombings, the United States expanded its manufacturing capacity to more than 50,000 aircraft a year. Boeing's chairman declared in 1944 that the war will be won by timelines, not tactics. And he was right. Japan, geographically surrounded and limited in natural resources, resorted to a logic of survival, redistributing aluminum from bicycles, melting bells of Buddhist temples, adapting nautical engines to military aircraft. Germany, pressured on multiple fronts, was trying to speed up its production with the increasing use of forced labor and teenagers in factories. The United States, on the other hand, offered 3 meals a day to its workers, competitive wages and, in many cases, daycare centers within industrial complexes. The war in production was unequal. For every Japanese plane delivered in 1944, the United States produced 15. Perhaps the most symbolic statistic comes from the comparison between replacement times. A bomber shot down over the Pacific was replaced on average in 5 days. Japan, on the other hand, took on average 3 weeks to rebuild a fighter. This pace had direct consequences on the battlefield. General LeMay, upon taking over 21st Bomber Command, not only inherited hundreds of B-29s, he also inherited the confidence that even if he lost dozens of them in a single mission, the flow of replacement would not stop. It was the first time that a commander could plan operations based not on the limitation of resources, but on the guarantee of abundance. And this abundance was not restricted to airplanes. Each B-29 required fuel, armament, spare parts, ammunition, groceries, tools, and above all, skilled personnel. Each operational unit mobilized, directly or indirectly, hundreds of civilian and military professionals. To keep a single bombing wing operating out of the Mariana Islands, the United States built, literally from scratch, concrete runways on captured islands, ports supplied by continuous convoys, control towers with modern radio equipment, and advanced maintenance shops. The American logistics system functioned as an unbroken global chain. From the factory to the target, each part had a clear, measurable, and replicable function. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, it possessed a sophisticated carrier fleet and a feared reputation for pilot versus pilot. In less than 4 years, his aviation has become irrelevant in the face of the American ability to produce, transport, and sustain war, as if managing a stockpile. For Japanese strategists, the B-29 represented only the tip of the iceberg. The real enemy was the one that sustained that plane. Factories with 3 shifts, armored trains carrying parts, engineers overseeing each rivet. A Japanese intelligence colonel wrote in an internal report, "We are facing a war against the American assembly line, and it never stops." This realization would come too late. By 1945, missions from Tinian, Saipan, and Guam were no longer sporadic. They were routine. Each week, hundreds of tons of bombs were dropped on Japanese cities, destroying not only military targets, but also the country's economic and social base. The war of attrition, which the Japanese believed they could maintain for years, began to crumble in a matter of months. The problem was no longer just the lack of planes or pilots. It was the impossibility of maintaining any kind of effective reaction against an enemy that was multiplying in factories thousands of miles away. A German engineer from Messerschmitt, visiting a bombed facility in 1945, wrote in his diary, "While we are trying to rebuild one wing, the Americans build 5 airplanes." The B-29, a symbol of air supremacy, was just the visible tip of an invisible and silent machine, industry, and it was about to be used even more precisely, more destructively, and more calculated than ever imagined. Because the next mission would not be against factories, ships, or airstrips. It would be against the very backbone of an entire city, and the target had a name, Tokyo. In mid-1944, B-29 bombers began to appear in the skies of Japan with the same grandeur they displayed on the production lines of the United States. Flying at more than 30,000 feet, these aircraft crossed the Pacific with the mission of reaching industrial and logistical centers of the Japanese Empire. But what seemed on paper an unbeatable offensive soon turned into a strategic stalemate. The first attacks faced obstacles that no engineering textbook predicted. The jet stream. These powerful winds, exceeding 200 miles per hour, cut through the stratosphere with such ferocious intensity that they deflected bombs for miles from their targets. Crews reported that even with adjusted calculations, the bombs exploded in random locations, often in unmapped civilian areas or in empty fields. The jet stream, until then a meteorological curiosity, has become a tactical barrier. The technology of the Norton targeting systems, which had worked accurately over Europe, proved ineffective when targets disappeared under dense layers of clouds or were pushed out of range by the wind itself. Frustration took over the crews. Pilots flew for more than 14 hours on round-trip missions with unimpressive results. Very expensive bombs, often with precision fuses, hit forests, rivers, or non-strategic areas. Morale began to decline. The American press demanded results, the High Command demanded numbers, and the data, up to that point, were embarrassing. Between June and December 1944, less than 15% of the bombs dropped fell within 1,500 yards of the designated target. In contrast, bombing operations over Germany averaged 40% effectiveness. The distance between theory and practice was evident and dangerous. The Japanese, even without intercepting the bombers frequently, realized the ineffectiveness of the attacks and interpreted it as operational weakness. The Japanese military government touted that B-29s were blind demons, loud, but eyeless. They were not wrong. Even with onboard radar and modern navigation instruments, the B-29s fought against a theater of war that defied their specifications. The climb to 30,000 feet was so demanding on the engines that the rate of mechanical failure tripled. The metal alloys used in the cylinders of the Wright R-3350 overheated at altitude, causing internal fires, loss of pressure, and failures in hydraulic systems. The mission abandonment rate reached 16% in certain operations. Each return without bombing meant waste of fuel, aircraft wear, and risk of life without any military return. The pressure for change was inevitable. And it was in this scenario that the figure of Curtis LeMay began to gain prominence. A general with a technical profile, impatient with static doctrines, and famous for personally testing the limits of his crew. LeMay didn't believe in luck or heroism alone. He believed in efficiency. Upon taking command of the 21st Bomber Command, he inherited a powerful machine with poor results. And the first decision was to face the obvious. Technology, by itself, would not defeat that enemy. Everything had to be rethought, from altitude to weaponry, from flight training to payload. Before that, however, LeMay had to understand Japanese logic, and it was in this process that a revelation changed the course of the war. Japan's industry was not concentrated in large factories as in Germany. It was spread across thousands of domestic workshops, integrated into the urban fabric of cities such as Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. Women, the elderly, and adolescents produced precision parts in houses adapted as manufacturing units, and no high-precision bomb, dropped at 30,000 feet, could destroy this type of target. The enemy wasn't behind concrete walls. He was behind rice paper doors. The failure of the initial missions was not only technical, it was conceptual. The Americans had imported the logic of the air campaign from Europe to the Pacific, ignoring geography, climate, and the Japanese industrial model itself. General LeMay would later write, "We did not understand the enemy. We were using a sledgehammer to crush sand." Meanwhile, in the German High Command, intelligence reports showed surprise at the slowness of American results in the Pacific. One Luftwaffe officer even wrote, "They have the perfect weapon, but they don't know where to hit." The irony was that behind this apparent inefficiency, something was about to be recalibrated. LeMay would begin to put together a new doctrine, one that would abandon altitude, sacrifice defensive armament, double the incendiary bomb payload, and bring the war to altitudes where even the sound of propellers could be heard from the ground. But for that, it would be necessary to accept the risk and redefine the morale of the attack. Precision would cease to be a goal. It would become fire itself. The strategy would change not only the course of the conflict, it would change the very history of bombing as a weapon of war, because when the clouds impede the aim and the winds deflect the bombs, there is only one option left: lower, drop everything, and set the entire map on fire. And that's exactly what LeMay decided to do. Curtis Emerson LeMay was no ordinary strategist. The son of a Midwestern worker, he graduated in engineering from Ohio State and entered aviation with a more analytical than heroic eye. He was known for his rigidity, his unpopular decisions, and his refusal to romanticize war. For LeMay, results were more important than reputations, and by 1945, results in the Pacific were far below expectations. American technology had promised precision warfare, but Japanese weather, relief, and doctrine required an approach that was not in the textbooks. It was then that LeMay decided to do what many in command considered unthinkable: fly lower, fly at night, carry more bombs, and abandon the idea of precision as the primary goal. The solution wasn't in the targeting systems, it was in saturation, and for that he needed to sacrifice something. He began by removing most of the defensive machine guns from the B-29s. The bow, side and dorsal armament were removed, keeping only the tail turret. This lightened the overall weight, allowing it to carry almost twice as many incendiary bombs. LeMay knew that Japanese fighters had difficulty operating at night and that Japan lacked effective radar. By giving up self-defense, he gained a volume of destruction. It also authorized missions to take place at altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, far below the doctrinal standard of strategic bombing. The risk was greater, but the efficiency would be lethal. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. It was the opposite of what they had tried for months. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more detailed content like this. LeMay also understood something that other commanders ignored. Japan's industrial structure was not centralized like Germany's. Instead of large factories, the country produced war components in small family workshops scattered throughout residential areas. Houses, temples, and corner shops housed lathes, precision tools, aluminum molds. The production was invisible at 30,000 feet, but at 5,000 feet, with the city lit up by the fire itself, everything became a target. The tactical choice had a mathematical and psychological basis. The M69 incendiary bombs, with gelatinous napalm and a delayed wick, did not require a direct hit. It was enough to fall in a dense urban neighborhood to spread virally. LeMay wanted to create what he called a continuous firestorm. Not one-off attacks, but self-sustaining fires that consumed entire neighborhoods from the inside out. The goal was no longer to destroy specific targets. It was to destroy the very concept of the city. The orders were transmitted accurately. Night flight, low altitude, LORAN radar navigation, continuous flow of planes. Start with pathfinders using M47 napalm to mark the area, and mass attack with M69 clusters. Each B-29 would carry about 7 tons of bombs, double the previous average. For a mission involving more than 300 bombers, the total volume exceeded 1,600 tons of incendiary material. It wouldn't be a surgical mission, it would be a planned saturation of fire. LeMay did not ask for authorization, he just executed. It was a tactical gamble that depended on one variable: the absence of effective Japanese air resistance. And he was right. The Japanese night fighters were poorly trained, lacking radar, with rationed fuel and limited armament. In previous operations, less than 5% of the B-29s had been shot down by interceptions. LeMay knew that with the surprise of the night attack and the volume of aircraft, the Japanese defense would collapse. By rethinking the mission not as a traditional military action, but as an industrial operation of urban destruction, LeMay has shifted the war to a new level. He abandoned the war between armies and began to conduct a war against the functional fabric of society. The enemy was no longer the soldier, it was the fireman, the craftsman, the postman, the lathe operator. This logic would accompany him for the rest of his life. "If we had lost the war," he said years later, "I would have been tried as a criminal." But in 1945, he didn't think about courts. He thought about efficiency. And on March 9th, he put the theory to the test. Hundreds of aircraft began moving on the runways of the Mariana Islands with a cargo never before used in combat. The mission had a name, Operation Meeting House, and the target was a residential area with a high population density, narrow streets, wooden structures, and no effective defense. The city was Tokyo, and in less than 12 hours it would cease to exist as it was known. But before the first B-29 crossed the Japanese coast that night, there was still one factor to consider. Japan was not as defenseless as it seemed. It had its night fighters, its anti-aircraft guns, and its own logic of resistance. And the next part of this story reveals how those defenses were tested and bent in the face of what the Americans were about to launch. On the night of March 9, 1945, Japanese radars failed to ring, and not because they were turned off, but because they weren't there. In an era when radar decided the lifespan of a city, Japan operated blindly. Its air doctrine still relied on observers on the ground, listening to the distant sound of engines and pointing with binoculars at the dark sky. Searchlights scanned the firmament in search of silver figures, and artillery operators made mental calculations based on estimated wind speed and direction. It was an anachronistic defense, put to the test against the most advanced air operation of the century. The Imperial Air Force relied on night fighters such as the Nakajima J-1N Gecko and the Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu, but both were scarce, poorly distributed, and flown by men with only a few hours of night flight time. Many of these promising models never made it past the experimental phase or were allocated to secondary fronts. In Tokyo that night, only a fraction were available, and none equipped with reliable onboard radar. The shortage of technology was not only the result of the American naval blockade, it was structural. Japan had entered the war believing that the spirit of sacrifice would make up for the industrial gap. But against the B-29, spirit was not enough. The American bomber was flying too high for most fighters, too fast to be stopped by anti-aircraft batteries, and that night it would fly too low and fast for any visual defense to react. What remained for the Japanese defense was a set of Type 88 anti-aircraft guns installed at strategic points in the capital. These weapons, while respectable in 1937, were outdated by 1945. Its effectiveness depended on manual calculations and visual aiming, almost useless against mass night attacks. For every B-29 shot down, hundreds of shells had to be fired at random. Worse, the operators of these guns had been trained to aim at formations at 30,000 feet. They were not prepared for planes appearing at less than 10,000 feet, at high speeds, and on unpredictable routes. The American operation was designed to exploit this void. By flying in successive waves with minimal spacing, the B-29s would saturate the airspace in a single direction, preventing any coordinated response. The Pathfinders would drop the first napalm bombs to create areas of light and heat, and that light, ironically, would be the only radar the Japanese would see that night. The lack of technological preparation was known by the high command officers themselves. An internal Imperial Army report, written in early March, stated, "The capital has no effective defenses against nighttime saturation attacks. The available resources are symbolic." And yet, no emergency measures were taken. The belief was that Tokyo, due to its political and spiritual importance, would not be the target of an attack of this magnitude. The miscalculation was absolute. While civilians slept in wooden houses covered in rice paper, the Americans were making the last course adjustments over the Pacific. On the ground, the observation posts still followed outdated standards of auditory detection. The doctrine provided that the sound of enemy engines would be detected about 50 kilometers from the coast. But that night, the sound came too late. The attack was announced by a flash, not by radar, radio, or air alert, but by the first explosions in the Shitamachi neighborhood. The fury of the fire was the first tactical information Japan received. From then on, everything was silence. The fighters that tried to take off did not find their targets. The spotlights swirled in circles, illuminating clouds. And the anti-aircraft guns, firing in desperation, hit more houses than bombers. The difference between the nations was not just in firepower, it was in time. While the United States invested in automatic navigation systems, remote fire control, and gyroscope-stabilized sights, Japan was betting on watchful eyes, firm voices, and ancestral courage. A functional strategy against biplane bombers in 1937. Irrelevant against a squadron of 325 radar-guided B-29s. The abyss was civilizational. A German officer reading the reports on the bombings in Tokyo reportedly said they were hit by an industry, not by an army. And that industry, that night, was just getting started. Because the first incendiary bombs had already lit up the map of the city, and what would follow was no more war, it was programmed combustion. The weapon that would fall on Tokyo that night was not created on the battlefield, but in laboratories and factories. Its name was M69, a small steel cylinder about 50 centimeters long, containing about 2 kilograms of gelatinized napalm and a fuse programmed to trigger the inferno with mathematical precision. It was a dispersal incendiary bomb, designed to start hundreds of fires simultaneously, but its true dark genius was in the behavior after the impact. When it hit the ground, the M69 broke into segments, releasing the napalm in flaming jets that stuck to any surface: wood, fabric, human skin. The substance burned at more than 800 degrees C and, unlike ordinary flames, could not be extinguished with water. On the contrary, contact with water spread the napalm even more, expanding the burning area. The conception of this weapon was not accidental. It has been meticulously studied. In the Utah desert, the U.S. Army built full-scale replicas of Japanese neighborhoods with the same construction techniques, the same materials: cedar wood, rice paper, tatami mats, ceramic roofs. Experts in Eastern architecture were consulted. Sociologists, civil engineers, and even ethnographers participated in the studies. The tests revealed ignition patterns, fire behavior in narrow corridors, and the speed of flame propagation between adjoining dwellings. From this information, the engineers optimized the time of the M69's fuse, 3 seconds of delay after impact, enough for it to penetrate between boards, mattresses, or structures, and then detonate with maximum thermal effect. It was a science of urban destruction. The napalm used in the M69 was not just gasoline with soap, as in the early models. It was an improved mixture with fatty acids and additives that increased viscosity and combustion time. Each bomb released a trail of fire of up to 30 meters, lasting more than 10 minutes, and a single aircraft could carry more than 300 of these units. The clusters, the technical name for the M69 sets, were launched from pods that opened in mid-air, dispersing the bombs randomly over the target area. It was a shower of giant matches over a city of straw. Japanese officials, who had known about the effects of firebombs since the attacks in Chongqing and Hankou, still did not imagine the scale that American napalm could reach. What Japan considered a one-off threat, isolated fires, controllable with buckets and brigades, would turn into a self-sufficient firestorm in a matter of minutes. The fire generated by the M69 didn't just destroy structures. It sucked oxygen from the streets, collapsed atmospheric pressure between neighborhoods, and created a phenomenon known as a firestorm. A firestorm fueled by the very wind generated by the flames. The heat melted tram tracks, blew up water tanks and caused bodies to evaporate before they touched the ground. The bombs had been created for this purpose, not to kill soldiers, but to kill cities. Every feature of the M69 is designed to fight not tanks, not bunkers, but homes. Its psychological impact was as lethal as the physical. Civilians, upon hearing the sound of the cracks that preceded the release of napalm, often threw themselves into wells, ditches, rivers, and there they suffocated or burned to death. The sound of its activation became known among survivors as the hiss of hell. And that wasn't poetic, it was technical. The engineering behind the M69 was the result of a joint effort between the Army, universities such as Harvard, and industrial laboratories. The development of napalm, led by Louis Fieser, a renowned chemist, was celebrated at the time as a scientific triumph. A few years later, he would be the target of deep ethical criticism. But in 1945, it was just another piece of data in efficiency spreadsheets. Each neighborhood had an estimated demographic density. Each type of construction had a combustion index. And for each city, there was a table indicating the optimal number of M69s to be launched. The war had ceased to be a contest of forces to become a laboratory simulation. The M69 was, in this context, the perfect solution. Produced on a large scale, cheap, light, efficient, with prolonged effects and almost absolute control over its dispersion. If the atomic bomb was still a prototype kept secret, the M69 was the finished product of the science of destruction. And that night, Tokyo would be his showcase. For American strategists, the effectiveness of M69 would not be measured in broken skulls or pierced armor, but in square meters reduced to ashes. The goal was simple: to turn 15 square miles of city into a burning plain. And the fire, fueled by this perfect weapon, would accomplish the mission. A German intelligence officer, reading the reports on the chemical composition of napalm, reportedly said, "This is not a bomb. It is a solvent of civilization." And that solvent was already in free fall over Tokyo. But before touching the ground, there was something to consider. The plan of attack was not just technical, it was choreographed. Every bombing wave, every interval, every flight path was drawn as a score of destruction. And in the next part, we will see how American precision organized chaos with military discipline, because even hell there followed a schedule. At 5:34 p.m., on March 9, 1945, the first B-29 began moving on the runway at Northfield Air Force Base on Tinian Island. It was just the beginning of a choreography calculated with surgical precision. More than 300 aircraft would take off that night, spaced by exact minutes, with route and cargo defined by engineers and meteorologists. But none of this was the work of chance. Before any bombs were loaded, before any crew received instructions, the American military had consulted a group that until then rarely decided the fate of cities: meteorologists. Air Force scientists analyzed months of weather data, studied atmospheric patterns over the Japanese archipelago, and identified a perfect window. A rare moment when surface winds would be calm, humidity low, and atmospheric pressure stable. No rain, no clouds, no high currents, everything a large-scale fire needed to breathe. The date chosen was not symbolic, it was functional. The prevailing winds in March tend to blow from west to east, and the target neighborhoods in Tokyo, dense, flat, interconnected, offered a favorable geometry for the fire to spread like a liquid over the urban fabric. The goal was to turn the city center into a thermal trap, and to do so, the first wave of the operation, the Pathfinder planes, would drop cross-shaped M47 incendiary bombs, marking 4 cardinal points around the Shitamachi neighborhood. When the bombs exploded, they would create a rectangle of flames. The following waves of bombers would enter from the south, launching their M69 clusters within this perimeter. The fire would be trapped, spiraling and consuming everything in its center. It was a mathematical operation disguised as a military mission, and each phase obeyed calculations: the flight time of the aircraft, the melting time of the pumps, the evaporation rate of napalm. Even the slope of Tokyo's roofs was considered. The architects consulted by the Americans had warned, ceramic roofs under wood create pockets of heat that make it difficult to dissipate smoke and increase internal combustion. It was the ideal setting for the M69. Meanwhile, in Japan, there was no centralized national weather forecast. The systems were regional, rudimentary, and focused on agriculture. No critical fire condition advisory was issued. No preventive evacuation was considered. The country that, 3 years earlier, had attacked Pearl Harbor based on months of climate study was now a victim of the same science, applied against it. The schedule of the operation was followed to the letter. At regular intervals, bomber groups flew over the city, each with its own sector of operation. The logic was to saturate the area with smaller fires that, when encountered, would generate a firestorm, an atmospheric phenomenon in which the heat itself generates updrafts, pulling in oxygen at high speed and fueling autonomous flames. The calculation was cold. For every square mile, it would take 1,665 incendiary bombs to generate full ignition. Based on this, the military determined the exact payload for each aircraft. The intervals between waves have also been optimized. If the planes flew too close together, the risk of collision increased. If spaced too far, the fire would dissipate before the next batch arrives. The sweet spot was set, 3 minutes between each formation, a sequence that kept the Tokyo sky lit up for more than 2 hours. And when the first wave returned to the Marianas, the last ones still flew over the Japanese coast. It was an aerial wake of uninterrupted destruction. The Germans, attentive to intelligence reports, had underestimated this capability. American production of napalm in 1945 already exceeded 450,000 tons, twice as much as all the explosive used by the Luftwaffe during the siege of Stalingrad. And the logistics chain was so efficient that every downed or damaged plane could be replaced in a week. The scale of the operation was simply inconceivable by European standards. If you were also surprised by this statistic, comment below with the phrase, "Logistics wins," because this war was not being won with bravery, it was being won with calculation. Tokyo was chosen not only because it is the capital, but because of its urban structure. Old neighborhoods, glued houses, narrow streets. A fire there did not spread. It multiplied. The city has become a real-time experiment. A paper city facing off against an army of metal. And as the B-29s flew in circles, dropping their payloads with near-robotic precision, Japanese observers on the ground could do nothing but report, "The sky is orange, and it doesn't get dark." But this was only the first stage of the operation. The next part of the story will no longer be about calculation or wind. It will be about what happens when fire meets flesh, bone, and despair. Because now, the fire has descended to street level, and Tokyo began to scream. At 10:35 p.m., the first B-29 Pathfinder broke through the darkness of the Japanese sky and dropped its payload over neighborhoods south of the Sumida River. There was no resistance, no fighter, no searchlight, only silence, the kind of silence that precedes what cannot be reversed. The M47 bombs fell in a cross, marking the limits of the target area. They burst into viscous flames, creating streaks of orange light that, seen from above, delineated a carefully drawn death field. At 10:40 p.m., the sirens sounded. Too late. Tokyo residents were used to false alerts, with planes flying overhead and moving forward. Many did not seek shelter. Others took to the streets, curious, staring up at the red-hot sky. unaware that they were within a perimeter designed for full combustion. Then came the second wave. The first clusters of M69 exploded over Shitamachi houses at 10:45 p.m. Within seconds, hundreds of small fires sprouted between the alleys. The napalm, thick as hot honey, ran down the walls, entered through the windows, stuck to clothes and bodies. The temperature exceeded 800 degrees Celsius. Oxygen began to disappear. The noise of the flames drowned out any scream. The sound of the city was replaced by a continuous roar, as if the earth was burning from within. In neighborhoods such as Honjo and Asakusa, houses collapsed within minutes. Tatami mats have become torches. Curtains, futons, closets, everything was fuel. The roofs exploded into shards of red-hot wood. The city breathed fire, and the more it burned, the more the air was sucked in to fuel the storm. The whirlwinds appeared, spiral air currents, formed by the difference in pressure between the areas already on fire and the neighborhoods still intact. These vortices spewed embers more than 200 meters away, starting fires in areas that had not yet been directly hit by the bombs. The fire traveled over the rooftops, jumping from block to block. In less than 30 minutes, downtown Tokyo was no longer a map, it was a burning organism. Yoshiko, a 24-year-old nurse, saw the hospital where she worked turn into an oven. The curtains caught fire first, then the uniforms hung, and finally, the patients themselves. She ran with a bucket of water, but the water evaporated before it touched the ground. The heat bent spoons, cracked glass, melted the soles of shoes. Hospitals were not spared, neither the temples nor the schools nor the parks. There were no military targets there. There was a city, just a city. Civilian firefighters, armed with hand hoses and thin metal helmets, tried to organize resistance. But how to contain a fire that arose from all sides at the same time? In less than an hour, many combat units were dead or had abandoned their posts. The fire hydrants exploded, the hoses melted, the smoke blinded. With each rescue attempt, the rescuers themselves were swallowed by the flames. The families who ran to the underground shelters found a new trap there. The thin air, the smoke coming down the entrances, the accumulated heat, turned the basements into suffocation chambers. In several neighborhoods, survivors did not burn to death. They died without air. The asphalt softened. The wheels of the cars sank. Bicycles were swallowed by the sidewalks. The floor, the wall, the sky, everything vibrated red. From above, the B-29 pilots reported a mesmerizing sight. The city burned with its own brilliance. Each street looked like a river of lava. The mission, according to the radios, was being a success. The plan was fulfilled with precision. But down below, order was collapsing. Entire groups tried to reach the Sumida River, believing that the water would be protection. But when they reached the shore, they found a desperate crowd. Hundreds were already inside the river, clinging to wood, trying to breathe among the ashes. Others threw themselves without knowing how to swim. The damp clothes stuck to the body like traps. The heat made even the water feel hot, and yet it was the only place that didn't burn. Between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., the firestorm reached its peak. The flames reached 300 meters high in some places. The vortex of heat pulled tiles, wood, entire bodies into whirlpools. The density of the flames was such that the sky, according to survivors' reports, seemed solid. An 8-year-old boy, hiding under the table in his house, saw the wall disappear. It didn't fall, it dissolved. His father tried to protect him with his own body, but it turned to coal before the boy fainted from lack of air. This was the new war, a war where the enemy did not shoot back, where there were no trenches, no counterattacks. There was only the waiting for the heat, the smoke, the explosion. Meanwhile, the B-29s continued in formation, releasing their payloads as if they were fulfilling a production cycle. The accuracy was so great that in less than 3 hours, the main targets had been saturated. The sky of Tokyo was now a burning mirror. But the destruction was not over yet. Because what would come after would not be another sequence of explosions, it would be absence. the absence of the city, of identity, of direction, and the next part reveals, in detail, what was left when the smoke cleared. Because the largest non-nuclear air attack in history was not yet over. In the labyrinthine streets of Shitamachi, time has ceased to exist. There was no more past, no future, just the absolute gift of fire. Entire families tried to escape with buckets of water, wet sheets, children in their arms. But none of that mattered. Heat was an entity, invisible but brutal. The glass of the windows melted in fillets as if crying. The walls, once solid, crackled with sounds of wood coming from the inside out. The air became thick, almost solid, unbreathable. The temperature exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius in some areas, enough to set fire to clothes with no visible flame, a heat that is not seen but that consumes inside. In neighborhoods such as Fukagawa and Kanda, houses collapsed even before they were directly touched by the bombs. The very vortex of the firestorm created a downward force that ripped off roofs, pulled beams, cracked walls. When the structure gave way, there was no time to escape. Fathers died trying to dig a passage with their hands. Mothers froze in moments of absolute despair. Their children simply disappeared. The bodies didn't get charred. They evaporated. Civilian trenches, built as makeshift shelters, have become death chambers. The hot air seeped through cracks, descended in silent waves, and turned the refuge into an oven. In many cases, those who were saved did so by remaining outdoors, running through the chaos, while those who sought shelter succumbed in silence. The civil firefighters, still organized in the first hours, began to retreat. The water from the hoses turned to steam before reaching the flames. Equipment melted in his hands. At a checkpoint south of Asakusa, 3 men were found hugging next to a dry fire hydrant, dead but still in a fighting position. In another sector, a train station was engulfed in flames with passengers inside. The doors, melted by the heat, did not open. The smoke did the rest. The chaos advanced faster than the sound. Sirens, screams, explosions, everything was muffled by the thermal pressure which created an invisible bubble around the city. It was the silence of collapse. The newspapers, which the day before had printed headlines about rice production and the last naval victory, no longer had a press. The Nihon Shimbun printing plant burned down along with the employees. The city was falling apart. Schools, transformed into aid stations, have become pyres. In one of them, 40 children hid in the library. None survived. Their bodies were found days later, fused to the metal of the bookshelves. At the Sumida Municipal Hospital, the maternity ward collapsed under the weight of the incandescent roof. Nurses covered the newborns with their own bodies. Some were later pulled out alive. But babies don't. In later records from the Japanese Red Cross, it was possible to identify a pattern. The survivors were almost always outside buildings or on the banks of the Sumida River. Those who sought shelter inside, those who relied on traditional architecture, those who believed it wouldn't be so serious, disappeared with their homes. One resident reported, "I looked back and my street was no longer there. Not in ruins, not on fire. She was just gone." The ground, once firm, began to give way in some areas. The underground galleries collapsed under the weight of the molten structures. The concrete cracked. Electricity poles were falling in flames. Tram lines twisted like metallic serpents. The American plan was to destroy neighborhoods, but what we saw was the city crumble like a burnt fabric inside, and in the center of it all, the authorities disappeared. The radios went silent. The civilian commands had nowhere else to operate. There was no coordination, no organized evacuation. Tokyo didn't burn like a city. It collapsed like a living organism, losing function by the minute. When the last group of B-29s left Japanese airspace at 2:30 a.m., there were no more visible targets. Just a dark, steaming mass where whole blocks had once been. In some areas, the fire was still on its own, as if refusing to end the cycle. The wind, which had been calculated by meteorologists as ideal for spreading the fire, now made it difficult to fight the last outbreaks, and the sky, which had previously announced the arrival of the bombers, now reflected the color of the ground. A German officer reading the report sent by spies in Japan reportedly said, "They did not destroy a city, they have erased a stand." And indeed, the maps of Tokyo would need to be redrawn. But the biggest revelation would come with the light of day, because what the pilots saw from above, the lines of fire, the explosions, the targets accomplished, was nothing compared to what American soldiers would encounter when they set foot there weeks later. The true dimension of the attack was not in the flames, but in the ashes. And it's about those ashes and what was inside them that the next part will reveal. Because in Tokyo, the sun has risen, but there was no city to light it up. Her name was Yoshiko Hashimoto, 24 years. Recent mother. He lived in the Fukagawa neighborhood east of Tokyo on a narrow street where the houses leaned on each other as if they shared the same lung. On the night of March 9th, 1945, Yoshiko was holding her 6-month-old son, getting ready for bed. There was the noise of planes in the sky, nothing new. She had heard sirens before, and she had learned that most of the time the bombers went straight by. But that night, the city was not a passage, it was fate. The first explosion shook the windows at 10:40 p.m. Yoshiko's mother, downstairs, shouted for everyone to come downstairs. The father was trying to carry a suitcase. Her sister, only 17 years old, was crying. Yoshiko went downstairs with her son wrapped in a blanket. When he opened the door, he found the street already filled with the orange glow, not of visible fire, but of a sky that seemed to be lit from below. The first bombs fell a few blocks away, a flash followed by cracks, like wood crackling inside a giant fire. Within seconds, the neighborhood began to heat up. It was as if the air was boiling. Yoshiko tried to run with her family to the collective shelter, but the first heat vortices were already pulling the oxygen away. A neighbor fainted halfway. Another, on fire, ran in the opposite direction without screaming. The sound no longer obeyed. Yoshiko's father tripped. She pulled him in. The mother coughed up blood. The sister disappeared behind a smokescreen. Yoshiko ran. With his son glued to his chest, he entered an alley, trying to reach the Sumida River. That's what everyone said. Run to the river. But getting there was like crossing a field of invisible mines. Flames jumped from house to house. Glass was bursting on the floor. Electrical cables fell incandescent. At an intersection, she saw 3 bodies lying motionless, their faces covered by blackened cloths. Perhaps they had tried to protect themselves from the smoke. Maybe they were just sleeping. There was no longer any way to distinguish. The river seemed more and more distant. When Yoshiko arrived at Kiyosu Bridge, the tram tracks were twisted. The wood that supported the bridge burned underneath, as if it floated on embers. Even so, dozens of people crossed. Some fell, others stumbled over fallen bodies. Yoshiko held her son tightly. The blanket was starting to get hot. On the other side of the bridge, the banks of the river were already taken over by refugees. Some threw themselves into the water. Others tried to protect themselves with wet blankets. One woman dived with 2 small children. She emerged with only one. Yoshiko knelt in the mud on the bank, trying to wet a cloth to cover the baby's face. But the water did not refresh him. It was warm, cloudy, covered with ash and wood fragments. As she dipped her feet, Yoshiko felt the burn. Not a sharp pain, but a constant burning, as if the water were being heated from within. Next to it, a group was trying to escape in a small boat. The boat, overloaded, capsized. The screams did not echo. The smoke drowned everything out. Yoshiko looked up at the sky. There were no more stars, just a pulsating light which moved with the rhythm of the wind. The fire had no shape, no direction. It just grew. She looked around. His father was not. His mother was not. Your sister. She screamed for her. Nothing. He held his son and entered the river, up to the waist. The water seemed to burn, but it was the only option. Around, other women did the same. Some tried to keep their children floating on pieces of wood. Others cried in silence, hugging scraps of clothing and skin. Yoshiko stayed there. The smoke went down to the water level. The sky roared. But she remained. Hours later, when the winds shifted, the tide brought back whole bodies, pieces of roof, charred toys. Yoshiko came out of the water. The skin on his legs was raw. The blanket had stuck to her son's skin, but he was still breathing. She survived. The next morning, Yoshiko walked back to what was left of the street where she grew up. The ground was still smoking. The house was not there. Nothing was. None of the neighbors. No trace of wall. Only a dark spot where there was once a gate. She never met her sister again. The father's body was recognized by the burned watch on his wrist. The mother was listed as missing. Yoshiko survived, but did not return to live in the same country, because that Japan had burned, and she was one of the few who crossed this chasm with a baby in her arms and a name to remember. The irony, as always, was in the details. The house in which Yoshiko grew up had been built with wood imported from Manchuria, the same region that the Japanese Empire had invaded in 1931 to expand its power. Now, this wood had fed the fire that the Japanese never imagined would come from so far away, and what would remain of Tokyo after that dawn would be recorded not on maps, but in human silhouettes drawn on the walls. Where there was once shadow, there was now mark. The mark of a country that had encountered the war that it itself started. But that was just the beginning. Because while Tokyo was bleeding silently, the United States was already preparing the next mission, and she wouldn't use incendiary bombs. She would use atomic silence. Tokyo was not only destroyed by bombs, it was destroyed by its own geography. The neighborhoods chosen by American strategists, Koto, Chuo, Taito, were not targeted at random. They were, from the point of view of war engineering, fuels arranged in a continuous pattern. The streets of Shitamachi, for example, were only 3 meters wide. The houses, built of cypress wood and rice paper panels, were glued together. The fire didn't need to jump. He just walked. And he walked fast. The absence of fire corridors or containment structures transformed the urban fabric into a gigantic wick, where thermal propagation occurred in minutes. In the heat maps generated after the attack, you can see the circular pattern of the first bombs expanding into rings, like a stone thrown into a lake. But unlike water, the fire did not dissipate, it multiplied. Each house hit became a new ignition point. The temples, with their thick wooden roofs and centuries-old pillars, stood the test of time, but not napalm. The Eitaiji Temple, erected in 1624, burned from the inside like an ancient furnace before collapsing silently on the refugee faithful. Community markets, because they are large and full of stands, have become propagation chambers. The fabric tents functioned as candles. Food stalls exploded with the contact of flames in cooking gas cylinders. Even the rice distribution centers, one of the city's few food reserves, turned to ashes in a matter of hours. But the spread did not take place only through matter. The failure was systemic. Tokyo's civilian evacuation plan, drawn up in 1943, provided for the dispersal of families to outlying neighborhoods in the event of intense air attack. But the plan was never put into practice. There was a lack of vehicles, clear instructions, and above all, leadership. Many neighborhood chiefs, the Tonarigumi, disappeared or went into hiding at the first sign of collapse. The bomb shelters, in turn, were improvised, dug with household tools, average depth of 1.5 meters, covered with fragile boards. Few resisted the heat, and even those that resisted became thermal traps. Without adequate ventilation, the smoke invaded, the internal pressure rose, the air disappeared. On dozens of streets, charred bodies were found inside cesspools, hugging in a fetal position near the entrance, trying to breathe. Another critical factor was population density. In 1945, the target neighborhoods concentrated about 97,000 people per square kilometer. For comparison, modern Manhattan has about 27,000. This means that where there is space today, in Tokyo there was overlap. Floors upon floors, beds upon beds, families upon families. Space wasn't just scarce, it was compressed. When the fire came, there was nowhere to escape. One of the few attempts to create a containment barrier came from a group of firefighters who, desperate, demolished entire houses to try to open clearings, but it was too late. The logic of fire was exponential. For every second without restraint, the advance doubled, and when the wind changed direction around 2 a.m., and what had been burning in southern Sumida began to retreat north, restarting fires in already hit areas. What American planners knew, and the Japanese ignored, was that the city's urban layout would not only allow for efficient attack, but amplify the damage. The strategy there was scientific, like setting fire to a wooden anthill, how to cause not only physical but social collapse. And it worked. American production of M69 incendiary bombs exceeded 17 million units over the course of the war. Japan, by contrast, did not even have the structure to produce on a similar scale. Its largest incendiary weapons factory had been destroyed in 1944 and was never rebuilt. If this surprises you, leave a comment. Logistics wins. Because this was not a duel of courage, it was a massacre of capacity. Japanese doctrine based on honor and individual resistance never envisioned an enemy fighting with urban maps, chemical fuels, and thermal engineering. For American commanders, the neighborhood was the target. For the Japanese, the neighborhood was home. This difference in perception cost 100,000 lives in one night. And the structural consequences of the attack would still be felt for months. The water supply system collapsed in 40% of the city. Hospitals, already precarious, were buried, physically and functionally. Schools ceased to exist, which interrupted the basic education of thousands of children for weeks. Administrative offices were erased, even the public archives burned, and where there was civil registration, there was dust left. The fire didn't just burn the wood, it burned the identity, and there was still more to come, because this attack, although immense, was only the beginning of a 5-month campaign. And in the next part, the story moves forward to the moment when the generals themselves began to doubt the line that separates effectiveness from brutality. Because when an entire city becomes a target, what is left of humanity in charge? The streets of Shitamachi were not just streets. They were veins of a culture that had survived for centuries in the intertwining of alleys, in the aroma of fresh fish at dawn, in the polished wood of the family shops that passed from father to son as a spiritual inheritance. There, each block was a microcosm of stories. The carpenter who knew every door in the neighborhood, the lady who sold rice sweets on the same corner since before the First World War, the children who ran between the improvised Shinto shrines, where small papers with vows and prayers hung like fruits of hope. In the early hours of March 10th, none of this resisted. The fire didn't just destroy houses, it destroyed continuity. The social fabric that sustained the Japanese capital disappeared as completely as the walls that sheltered it. Entire markets, which were once centers of exchange and coexistence, became smoking craters where work tools merged with metal structures. The workshops, which built everything from toys to precision instrument parts, were swallowed up as if they had never existed. An artisanal industrial city based on manual skill evaporated in a few hours. The small temples, which marked the spiritual identity of the region, became twisted silhouettes. Seasonal festivals, which filled the calendar with parades, masks, dances, and drums, lost not only their spaces, but their protagonists. Entire families that maintained traditions from generation to generation, now absent. The fire, by consuming the physical structure, also attacked the collective memory. The stories told by word of mouth about the fisherman grandfather, the warrior great-grandfather, the matriarch who had survived the 1923 earthquake, disappeared with the notebooks, the albums, the family amulets, the sacred records. A city without archives becomes a city without a past. And Tokyo that morning was exactly that, a city amputated of its own identity. Even the survivors had difficulty recognizing the terrain. Streets that once formed busy intersections were now rectangles of plain grey. Trees that marked shady paths were reduced to charred, shapeless trunks. The wind moved fine particles of history, scattering the remains of homes over indistinguishable ruins. In many reports, residents returned to the neighborhoods and simply did not know where they were. The emotional geography had disappeared. The cultural erasure was so profound that after the attack, Japanese sociologists described the region as a land without names. An entire generation of spatial references disappeared. Traditional restaurants, where centuries-old recipes were kept as a family secret, have become dark dough. Schools where masters taught calligraphy, tea ceremony, and koto music, pillars of traditional education, left only bits of melted paint and deformed bells. Even the signs of the stores were consumed. What was left no longer had a voice. Without signs, without symbols, without landmarks, the city lost the vocabulary of its own existence. And this erasure was also spiritual. The shrines held not only religious objects, but also the community sense of protection. When their torii collapsed, what collapsed wasn't just wood, it was the belief that there were safe spaces within the city. The support networks, so fundamental in working-class neighborhoods, have broken down. The lady who brought soup to her sick neighbor no longer had a home. The blacksmith who repaired pots and umbrellas disappeared inside the urban oven. Extended families who had lived close together for decades were scattered like leaves in the wind. The city fragmented. Japan, a country whose identity is deeply associated with continuity, saw its biggest cultural rupture there since the Kanto earthquake. But unlike the earthquake, which was an unexpected natural tragedy, that dawn was the result of human calculation, an engineering of elimination. The United States knew exactly which neighborhoods would be affected and which social segments would be extinguished. And it revealed an irony that many Germans, so confident in the Luftwaffe's technical superiority, never understood. While Germany produced bombers in slow, centralized, and vulnerable cycles, the US created weapons capable of defining not just battles, but identities. The Luftwaffe would never have the logistical conditions to erase an entire city in hours. America, yes. This difference shaped the post-war period. A German officer, in reviewing the documents on Shitamachi, wrote, "The city has lost its soul, and this is more devastating than losing soldiers." The physical destruction, no matter how brutal, could be rebuilt. But cultural destruction, not that. It was irreversible. And as survivors walked through piles of ash looking for faces, names, and mementos, American commanders looked at reports of the attack. Metrics, maps, percentages, efficiency. For them, it was a completed operation. For Tokyo, it was the extinction of a way of life. But the tragedy of that night was not yet fully exposed. Because what would come next would show that, in addition to erasing entire neighborhoods, the incendiary offensive had another purpose: to test the limits of Japan's national collapse. And in the next part, the analysis leaves the terrain of memories and returns to the military field, where a silent decision was beginning to form within the American High Command. The dawn of March 10, 1945, brought no light to Tokyo, brought revelation. When the sun finally broke through the thick layer of smoke, he didn't find a city, he found a cold desert. Whole kilometers were leveled, as if someone had passed a giant blade over the oldest neighborhoods of the capital. Where once there had been markets, schools, workshops, and alleys full of life, now there was only smouldering rubble, charred pillars, and shadows of bodies imprinted on the ground, the result of heat that had surpassed any human limit. Civilians emerged from the margins of what was left of the streets, walking like spectres. Some carried pieces of wood that they believed were part of their homes. Others held burnt clothes that might have belonged to a relative. Most walked in absolute silence, unable to comprehend what had happened. The landscape offered no answers, it only offered absence. The schools, where children had hidden themselves believing they were protected, were now hollow structures, roofs collapsed inwards, rooms transformed into smoke chambers. In the courtyards, piles of ash mingled with the remains of melted toys. Koto's kindergarten, where 30 children took shelter, left only the twisted window frames and a swing, burned to dust. The wind blew these particles across the ground, scattering fragments of history over ruins that no longer had a recognizable location. The Sumida River, which had served as the last refuge for thousands the night before, now revealed its true dimension of horror. Hundreds of bodies floated among pieces of tile, broken furniture and charred beams. The extreme heat had evaporated some of the water by dawn, and with the reduced flow, corpses piled up on side benches, forming silent rows. At some points, firefighters, survivors, rowed with long poles, trying to push bodies to shores where they could be collected. The barges, normally used to transport rice, have been transformed into makeshift burial boats. With each whirlwind, the noise of the wood echoed like a lament. On the streets, or in what was left of them, the scenario was equally devastating. Entire administrative centers had disappeared. The Honjo District Police Headquarters fell like an ossuary, and its archives, documents, IDs, birth records burned to the ground. Families searching for relatives gathered in front of empty courts, trying to locate landmarks that simply no longer existed. There were no signs, there were no corners, there was no direction. Just the memory of how the neighborhood had been designed. A group of survivors searched the temple of Kamizawa, hoping to find bodies or relatives sheltered. The temple, built almost 4 centuries ago, had disappeared. Only its main gate, what was left of it, pointed like a black jaw to the sky. In front of him, the ground was covered in broken footprints, marks left by burned feet that ran until they disintegrated. Firefighters, now reinforced by soldiers, began the process of collecting bodies, but they were not whole bodies. In many cases, they found only isolated bones, fragments of skulls, heat-deformed jewelry, uniform buttons that outlived the wearers themselves. Military trucks were brought in to collect everything that could be cremated, not out of ceremony, but out of necessity. The amount was incalculable. Each neighborhood set up improvised pyres. Bodies were stacked in dozens, sometimes hundreds, because there was no other way to deal with the volume. The smoke from the fires mixed with the smoke from the funerals. For days, the Tokyo air smelled of burnt wood, burnt flesh, burnt history. In an open field in the Fukagawa region, about 300 residents gathered in silence before a pile of bodies, awaiting cremation. Some tried to identify relatives by their clothes. Others looked for any object that could serve as a reminder of those who had departed. A woman found a charred comb, the last object belonging to her daughter. She held him with both hands, as if holding the child's own spirit. The ruins also revealed the urban dimension of the destruction. Tram lines were twisted like metal snakes, buried in slabs of asphalt that had melted. Electricity poles toppled over what was left of the streets. Masonry buildings, which were supposed to withstand the heat more, collapsed from the inside, creating craters where there were once shops and offices. The fire did not respect materials, only opportunity. The destruction, now exposed by the clear light of the morning, revealed something that was not perceptible at night. The total absence of sound. There was no more screaming, there was no more running, just silence. The kind of silence that follows absolute calamity. For the Japanese command, the impact was immediate. Reports came in reporting 15 square miles destroyed, then 20, then 25. No one could believe it. The Minister of the Interior, when visiting the region, reportedly said only, "There is no city." It was a belated acknowledgement of a collapse foretold, not by enemy military strength, but by Japan's inability to grasp the scale of modern warfare. And that scale would become even more evident in the following days, when American aircraft would return to continue the Incendiary campaign. But before that, there was a question that echoed among survivors and Americans. How do you measure a loss that doesn't fit into numbers? The answer would come in the next phase, when the American military analysis revealed that Tokyo had not just been destroyed. Tokyo had been defeated with no chance of response, and what this defeat meant for the rest of Japan would change the course of the war. When the smoke finally allowed the first appraisers to walk through the ruins, the strategic dimension of the destruction became as clear as it was brutal. Japan did not wage its war in armored megafactories like Germany. Its war production was decentralized, pulverized in small family workshops hidden within the working-class neighborhoods. Aircraft parts, electrical components, precision instruments, valves, gears, switches, metal supports, all of this came out of ordinary homes where skilled craftsmen worked in silence. In Shitamachi, every street was an assembly line disguised as a neighborhood. And that's exactly what burned. More than 50% of the capital's industrial production evaporated within hours. Workshops that used imported lathes, adapted tools, handmade molds, disappeared along with the workers who operated them. Fire didn't just wipe out machines, it wiped out knowledge. Decades of manual skill were lost forever. Men trained in fine metallurgy, women who assembled miniaturized electrical systems, young apprentices who maintained the continuity of the techniques, all dead, displaced, or unable to return to work. Japanese production chains collapsed like paper houses. A cogwheel could not be replaced by improvisation. A navigational instrument could not be assembled without precision. And what Japan called the industrial backbone turned out, after the attack, to be a fragile mosaic supported by neighborhoods that no longer existed. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support, like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. At the same time, for the United States, the devastation proved the effectiveness of LeMay's strategy. The Air Command realized that every ton of napalm dropped was worth more than weeks of naval warfare. Reports presented to President Truman indicated that continued arson attacks could reduce Japanese production capacity to less than 10% in 3 months. At that rate, strategists argued the country would simply collapse. Without spare parts, without instruments, without the specialized labor that fed the dispersed industry, the Japanese war machine would become a carcass. It is at this point that the statistic that redefined the course of the war emerges. The annual production of incendiary bombs in the United States already exceeded 50,000 tons per month, while Japan, with its crumbling infrastructure, could not maintain even the basic supply of conventional ammunition. It was a logistical chasm that sealed the fate of the conflict even before the atomic bombs were considered. Subsequent strategic reports make it clear Tokyo was not just an attack, it was a test, a cruel rehearsal of what the US would do to dozens of other cities in the coming weeks. Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, they would all be subjected to the same cold reckoning, the same mechanism of industrial destruction. And as Japan saw its production fall, its workers disappear, and its neighborhoods disappear, it became apparent that there was no way to sustain the war. American victory was not just in the skies, it was on the factory floor, on the supply lines, in the ability to replenish resources infinitely. While Japan burned coal to survive, the US burned cities to win. And yet, strategic devastation was only one part of the equation. because as industries disappeared, something even deeper began to give way within the empire. The conviction that the war could be won. And in the next part, this collapse ceases to be industrial and becomes moral. The silence that hung over Tokyo after the dawn of March 10th was not the absence of sound, it was the presence of trauma. He infiltrated the houses that remained, the makeshift shelters, the corridors of the hospitals that survived, and especially the survivors who walked among the ruins as if they had left their souls in the flames. For many, war is no longer a distant conflict. It became a permanent shadow inside the head. Children wandered alone through the ashes, calling for parents who would never respond. Some remained seated in the same spot where they had been found at dawn, unable to move, unable to understand. Workers who had previously left early for family workshops now rose aimlessly, looking at erased neighborhoods as if they were pages torn from their own lives. The trauma was not limited to loss. It manifested itself in the involuntary repetition of the sounds of the night before. Many reported waking up to the wheezing of napalm, even days after the attack. Others heard, within their own memory, the muffled sound of the firestorm sucking the air. And there were those who simply did not speak. In Japanese medical reports, cases of sudden mutism, emotional breakdown, loss of coordination have multiplied. War, which for years had been fueled by the imperial narrative of force and sacrifice, now invaded the intimate space. Trust in the government was beginning to crumble. The authorities had promised protection, had spoken of spiritual invincibility, had encouraged civil resistance. But on the night of March 10th, the sirens sounded late, the shelters failed, the leaders disappeared, and the population discovered that the rhetoric did not stop fire. The psychological impact was not limited to civilians. In the following days, reports of Japanese soldiers returning from leave showed distraught men as they traversed completely destroyed areas. Many carried to the front the emotional weight of knowing that there was no more family waiting for them. Military morale plummeted. In the outlying districts where smaller factories still functioned, workers arrived late, left early, or simply stopped going. It wasn't protest as it was disorientation. The mind, exhausted by trauma, no longer obeyed the discipline of war. Authorities tried to contain the panic. Advertisements were spread, claiming that the United States had hit non-essential targets. But it was enough to walk a few blocks to deny the pamphlets. Warehouses burned, schools extinguished, evaporated families. The lie dissolved the last emotional bond between government and people. In the following months, a phrase began to circulate among the residents of the destroyed areas: routine raids. The term, recorded in later diaries and interviews, revealed the deep resignation of a people who had ceased to believe in the possibility of defense. Attacks that had once caused panic were now met with a combination of fear and apathy. It was as if the trauma had anesthetized the collective spirit. The psychology of survival has taken over the city. Mothers who lost children embraced children from other families as if they were their own. Brothers cared for brothers in makeshift tents, while volunteers tried to record names of missing people who would never be found. The search for relatives has become a daily ritual, walking through ruins, identifying remains of objects, looking for clues in the shadows. But many ruins were just that, indistinct carbon stains. The fire had consumed not only bodies, but identities. In the temples that partially survived, monks offered prayers for endless lists of the dead. In several cases there were no names, only rough descriptions of lost people, and this vagueness further amplified the trauma. How to mourn those who do not recognize themselves, how to end the pain of a disappearance that leaves no trace. A group of Japanese psychologists who worked during the reconstruction, still little known outside Japan, observed that the survivors of the firestorm showed patterns similar to those that would be identified decades later as post-traumatic stress disorder. Recurrent nightmares, extreme hypervigilance, social isolation, loss of interest in daily activities, involuntary memory flare-ups. The difference is that these symptoms were not from isolated individuals, they were from entire neighborhoods. Tokyo had become a traumatized city, and this trauma had a profound impact on the war. The productivity of the few remaining factories fell dramatically. Workers who once produced essential parts now made constant mistakes, left machines running, changed components, abandoned shifts. Japanese officials recorded a drop of up to 40% in the efficiency of certain assembly lines after the attack. War, once sustained by collective discipline, was now eroded by quiet despair. The Japanese Empire, so accustomed to cultivating an image of unshakable mental strength, began to realize that fire had destroyed something more valuable than metal or wood. It had destroyed the spirit of continuity, of duty, and of belonging. Even young children have taken to playing escape from the fire, running through debris, simulating the hell of the night before, a disturbing reflection of how trauma has seeped into the logic of childhood. And among the survivors, the most repeated word in the later testimonies was not fear, it was tiredness. A tiredness that did not come from the body, but from the soul. And yet the psychological impact would not be the end point. Because while Tokyo was drowning in grief, the United States interpreted Japan's emotional collapse not as a tragedy, but as a strategic indicator. And what would come next would show that, for American planners, the human mind was more of a military goal. In the next part, we'll look at how this calculation advanced into something even greater, the prospect that burning down cities could perhaps win the entire war without a single soldier landing. When the war ended and the world began to reorganize its narrative about the conflict, the dawn of March 10, 1945, simply slipped through the cracks of global memory. Not because it was small, on the contrary, it was the deadliest air raid in modern history, but because it did not offer the symbol that the post-war period desired. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had a singular glare, a mushroom that redefined the era. Tokyo does not. Tokyo had smoke, muffled noise, thousands of anonymous bodies, formless ruins. It was conventional destruction, even if on a scale never seen before. And in the effort to rebuild a world order based on nuclear innovation, the Tokyo fire has become an inconvenient chapter, difficult to fit into the before and after narrative of the atomic age. For the United States, there was another reason for the silence. The method used in Tokyo would be repeated dozens of times in cities large and small between March and August. What happened there was no exception. It was operational policy. Exposing the magnitude of that attack would mean admitting that the U.S. Air Force had mastered the art of destroying cities with industrial precision even before the atomic bomb existed. There was no strategic glamour in this. There was brutal efficiency, and efficiency rarely becomes a monument. The West preferred to remember the atom, not napalm. In Japan, however, the silence took another form. The pain was so great, so intimate, that for decades many survivors simply could not speak. The loss of entire families had created a broken memory, a void that could not find words. While Hiroshima developed a culture of testimony organized and supported by the world, Tokyo's survivors wandered for decades, trying to piece together scattered accounts. It was Katsumoto Saotomi, himself a child survivor at the time, who realized that this story was in danger of disappearing. He founded a center dedicated to gathering testimonies, objects, photographs, any fragment that could prevent the total erosion of memory. His work revealed an uncomfortable truth. The world hadn't forgotten Tokyo by accident. It had forgotten it by convenience. For many countries, it was easier to see the war as a sequence of exceptional events, Pearl Harbor, Stalingrad, Normandy, Hiroshima, than as a continuous chain of less cinematic but equally decisive destructions. The firestorm of Tokyo did not offer a single image, an innovative weapon, a clear villain. It was technique, calculation, saturation, and engineering. It was the product of hundreds of American factories, of thousands of engineers, of a science applied to the limit. It wasn't an icon, it was a process, and processes, unlike atomic explosions, do not populate monuments. Moreover, Cold War historiography preferred to emphasize the nuclear threat, not conventional fires. The destruction of Tokyo was swallowed up by a global discourse that wanted to show the nuclear age as an absolute rupture, leaving little room for the recognition that entire cities had already been obliterated by non-nuclear methods. In academia, it was only decades later that Japanese and American researchers began to revisit the Meeting House operation rigorously. They discovered disturbing details: entire replicas of Japanese neighborhoods built in Utah, urban density calculations to maximize deaths, thermal analysis to predict infrastructure collapse. And the question began to arise: why had the world never discussed this before? The answer was scattered between diplomacy, guilt, expediency, and the human desire to simplify the past. But while the West looked to the sky trying to understand the atomic bomb, Japan looked to the ground, where hundreds of thousands of families had been erased without a trace. It was a mourning without international monuments, without conferences, without dedicated treaties. Just silence, and this silence lasted so long that it became part of the very identity of the event. The largest airstrike in history has become a private memory, a pain kept in diaries, in the few dedicated museums, in the stories of survivors who only decades later found the courage to speak. But the most ironic part of this erasure is that it hid an essential fact. The world avoided looking at Tokyo because it was faced with something disturbing there, the proof that with enough technology and industry, one nation could destroy another without ever putting troops on the ground. And this finding, albeit silent, shaped all American planning for the following months. Because while the world forgot Tokyo, the strategists remembered. And in the next part, this hidden calculation will reveal its weight at the most decisive moment of the war, when the idea of burning cities gave way to something even more devastating. There was, at the end of the war, a question that few dared to ask directly. What really broke the spine of the Japanese Empire? The dominant narrative would say, decades later, that Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the conflict in an instantaneous, almost surgical coup. But military documents, official testimonies, and even the words of Emperor Hirohito himself tell a more complex and deeply uncomfortable story. Even before radiation marked the century, Japan was already on the verge of collapse. The firestorms that devastated Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of other cities had destroyed more than 50% of the country's productive capacity. Millions of displaced civilians, broken logistics chains, an artisanal industry annihilated, and public morale reduced to ashes. When Truman assumed the presidency, the American Air Command presented projections that showed that, even without atomic bombs, Japan would lose the ability to sustain the war by the end of 1945. The continuation of the incendiary attacks, accompanied by the naval blockade, was seen as sufficient to produce surrender by industrial asphyxiation. And there is one fact that exposes this strategic crudeness. Between March and August 1945, conventional bombing kills. It was a statistic that pierced the walls of the imperial palace. Hirohito, in secret meetings, referred not to the fear of the atom, but to the impossibility of continuing to resist in the face of systematic urban destruction. He described the devastated cities as skinless bodies, where nothing could thrive. The collapse of internal transport, the loss of skilled workers, and the physical extinction of entire neighborhoods had already imposed a silent sentence on the country. American strategists knew this. For many in command, The atomic bomb was less the ultimate weapon and more the last psychological push, an accelerator of the inevitable. Japan did not fall because the atom came into being. It fell because fire became routine. Sirens, once occasional, have become part of daily life. Cities, once centers of culture and work, have become weekly targets. Entire families lived with the permanent awareness that each night could be their last. War is no longer a battle. It has become absolute wear and tear. The technological capacity of the United States to transform destruction into an industrial process was the real watershed. A war machine was built capable of incinerating a city a week, and Japan, with no radar, no fuel, no resilient industries, no allies, had no way to respond. There are German officers who, in reviewing the reports of the American campaign in the Pacific, have recognized what the Reich Doctrine refused to admit. Scale wins. The industry wins. Whoever dominates the air dominates tomorrow. And this realization, added to the growing trauma among Japanese civilians, has pushed the country to the moral breaking point. The question that remains is disturbing. If ordinary fire already destroyed more than nuclear fire, what was really the fatal blow? The answer may lie not in Hiroshima, but in the sum of all the Tokyos burned before it. Which leads to the last reflection of this narrative, where the story does not seek culprits, but rather to understand the human, strategic, and moral weight of a war that could have ended before August. Because in the next part, it will be necessary to face the inevitable conclusion. Modernity has transformed the act of destroying into routine, and this routine has decided the end of war. When Japan finally communicated its surrender, the world saw only the end of a war. But for those who studied the previous months, what ended there was something bigger, the inevitable collapse of an industrial, military, and ideological model that had believed it was possible to confront a power whose arsenal was not just bombs, but assembly lines. The Japanese defeat, like the German defeat in Europe, did not occur only in the skies or on the battlefields. It occurred in the factories that could not replace what was burning, in the empty arsenals, in the cities turned into coal. Once the United States demonstrated its ability to produce more aircraft, more engines, more ammunition, and more fuel than its enemies combined, war ceased to be a military contest and became an inevitable calculation. The side that could continue fighting would win, and the one that could not would fall apart. It was this cold formula that Tokyo confirmed in March 1945. Industrial power wins, even when the rest fails. And yet, behind this strategic outcome, there was something deeper. The memory of Yoshiko Hashimoto holding her son inside a boiling river around her, of streets where collective memory dissolved in minutes, of neighborhoods that sustained the identity of a people and disappeared with the impersonal precision of a logistical equation. The universal lesson of this story is that modern warfare is decided not by the bravest soldier, but by the most resilient gear. Not for the sharpest aim, but for the supply that does not cease. Technology amplifies strength, logistics sets the pace, and industry determines the end. And when these elements align, no doctrine based on honor, tradition, or sacrifice can stand up. One captured German officer, in analyzing this merciless logic, summed up his own nation's disaster, and unknowingly Japan's, in a bitter confession: "We were defeated by trucks." It was the admission that the war of the 20th century was not decided by courage alone, but by steel, fuel, and the mathematics of mass production. If you value serious research and the search for historical truth, please leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Comment on the most shocking data you discovered in this investigation, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact that we will reveal. Because history, when observed closely, is not only made up of victories or defeats, it is made of the traces left by every human, industrial, or military decision. And when the world rebuilt itself after 1945, Tokyo left a silent warning. Absolute efficiency comes at an absolute cost. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next real story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another amazing story.